Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC EduSec live lecture. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that very successfully we are running a series on history of English literature. We have completed sessions on various topics and we believe that you might have liked all of our lectures as our lectures are uploaded on YouTube for you. Dear friends, in this session today we would be talking on Victorian criticism. In the first half we would be discussing on the critical credo of the age, whereas in this second session we would be discussing on from Arnold to Wilde. And for this very discussion we have once again with us Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya is a highly acclaimed academician who is loved by the students both in India and abroad. Dear friends, let's welcome our guest Dr. Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya is here once again to give us elaborate information, elaborate knowledge on Victorian criticism. So without wasting any time, I would like to welcome our guest Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya once again. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSec lecture.
Thank you. Well, we shall discuss as informed the Victorian criticism today. We have already done Victorian poetry, Victorian prose. Today we will do Victorian criticism. Victorian criticism is important because for the first time in the history of English literature, we had on a very large scale practical criticism. Theoretical criticism has always been there because every age, with every new movement, there has to be some sort of manifesto. How is it different from the earlier one? So to explain that, each group of poets, particularly the leading ones, they gave their manifestos, like Wordsworth and Coleridge did, preface to lyrical ballads. Similarly, Dryden, Pope before them, they had given. Now, the Victorian leading poets like Tennyson, Browning, then Arnold, see, they had their own idea of what is poetry. So, obviously, they also had to sell it to the people, the new idea of what is meant by poetry. So for the first time, the emphasis came on criticism of life, so much so that Matthew Arnold defined poetry as criticism of life. Before that, you would recall during the Romantic age, criticism was taken negatively. Criticism was taken as something inferior, something which has nothing to do with the world of poetry. That is why when Scotch reviewers gave a harsh criticism of the English poets, Byron hit back. He wrote a poem called English Bards and Scotch Reviewers. So there he makes fun of the Scotch reviewers. So criticism was not taken kindly. Criticism was taken to be that I am being disliked or fault finding is being done about my poetry. That is how the response came from the practicing poets. But now it became almost equally respectable profession to be a critic. That is why the leading critic of the age, Matthew Arnold, could write so much. 2 series of essays in criticism and both voluminous. So that gives an idea how things had changed and criticism had become a respectable activity. People took it seriously. People waited for the new critical essays to come so that new ideas would come. So, here began a sort of debate among the practicing poets and other intellectuals, readers of poetry. Criticism has its positive side as well, in fact, more positive than negative. It is not just fault finding, it is working towards excellence, perfection, how to improve the art that you are practicing. So, wherever you find that somebody is failing in a particular aspect of poetry or literature, then there is nothing wrong if you point out in writing. So, that is how it began, and it became acceptable to all. Before the Victorians, it was not really acceptable. So, if we call the Victorian age the age of criticism, it will not be wrong, because for the first time we have criticism as an activity which is equally prized, equal to the creative art, and people look up to the critics to guide them as to what to look for in a poem, in a creative composition. So, the beginners of Victorian criticism were poets like John Stuart Mill, not really a poet, but more of a critic. John Stuart Mill, and then Thomas Carlyle, then Matthew Arnold, so on and so forth. So, there were several major critics of the age. No other age had such a large bunch of first-rate minds, great minds, engaged in writing about poetry. Earlier, they wrote poetry, but not about poetry. Now, these very poets are writing about poetry. What is poetry and what is good or bad in it? So, this practical criticism, so to say, began on a large scale in the Victorian age. And the first in this context is John Stuart Mill. He wrote 3-4 essays. First was, what is poetry? So he defines there what poetry is. Second is, two kinds of poetry, that it is not just one kind. There are different kinds, depending upon what you are writing about, depending upon in what mode or style you are writing about. And then the third one Mill wrote was Thoughts on Poetry and its Varieties. So, from one poetry to two kinds of poetry to varieties of poetry. So, that is how he expanded the critical view of poetry and made his readers aware of how critically you can look into a poem and find points of appreciation and points of depreciation also, faults. So both virtues and faults you have to look for in any given poem. That became the format for practical criticism. These essays Mill had written 1833. Formally, 1837 is the year when we say the Victorian age began, because Queen Victoria got onto the throne that year, and she had the longest period right up to 1903. So imagine 1837 to 1903, such a long period. The Queen of England. Here comes John Stuart Mill just a few years before that, but then he lived a long life. So how does he define poet? He says, whom shall we call poet? His definition is those who are so constituted that emotions are the links of association by which their ideas, both sensuous and spiritual, are connected together. So that is the definition of the poet. Here is an ability of the mind which is not available to everybody. Only the poets have it, he says. And what is that ability? That through emotions you are able to assimilate ideas and assimilate them into making it a complete whole. So all put together, maintaining their separate identity also, but combining to form a new structure altogether. So that is how Mill looked at emotions and ideas in a poem. So those who are so constituted that emotions are the links of association by which their ideas, both sensuous and spiritual, are connected together. In other words, in the case of a poet, it is the emotion which is central. Ideas are secondary. Ideas are to be accommodated through emotions. That is why it is poetry. Otherwise, prose is there. You can straight write about your ideas, but that will be an essay, not a poem. So in poetry, you do express your ideas, but you do that through emotions, means through some experience, not as a direct discussion of ideas, but as an experience of life. So you filter those ideas through the emotional experience that you have had. That is the difference between ideas in poetry and ideas in prose or essay. Now, Mill wrote two important things where you have these ideas about poetry. One is signs of the times. Signs of the time. This is Thomas Carlyle, because Mill I have already mentioned. The three pieces that he wrote. Three pieces were what is poetry, two kinds of poetry, and third, thoughts on poetry and its varieties. Now the second in line among the Victorian critics was Thomas Carlyle. And Thomas Carlyle also wrote critical pieces, one of which was titled Signs of the Times. So you can see that poetry is not something confined to itself, something apart from general life. These Victorian poets and critics, they never separated poetry from life. That is why it is defined by Matthew Arnold as criticism of life. So poetry is about life itself and nothing else. Therefore, the two are inseparable. They are so allied that one runs into another. If you think of one, you always come across the other. So Thomas Carlyle wrote two pieces. One was Signs of the Times, and the second was Practical Criticism, Death of Goethe. Paid a tribute to Goethe. Goethe was a great German poet, the leading poet of 19th century in Europe, the entire Europe, not merely in Germany, but in England, France, Italy, everywhere. Goethe was held in high esteem. So, Thomas Carlyle also pays a tribute to Goethe in his piece called Death of Goethe. So, these two pieces of practical criticism, Signs of the Times and Death of Goethe, you find Carlyle's ideas on poetry and poets. For Carlyle, the poet is endowed with, I am repeating his words, is endowed with extraordinary powers of perception. A man who can penetrate the mysteries of life and unfold them to the common people. So essentially a romantic idea. But even before that, if you go to the ancient times, the view of the poet was, in ancient times, for example, Greco-Roman, the view was that a poet is an inspired being. He has something exceptional in him, God-given. So a person above the ordinary, a person below the gods. So somewhere in between. That is why Homer, Sophocles, Virgil, these ancient poets, they were considered as sages, just like saints. You go to them for inspiration, you go to them to receive wisdom about life and about everything else. So that is how the poets at the time were viewed. They were viewed as sages, inspired beings who can look into life, its mysteries, which ordinary people cannot. So they have that power of perception. They can look into the interior of life, hence can give you its sensuous as well as spiritual side. So, that was the view that Carlyle also held of the poet. For him too, the poet is endowed with extraordinary powers of perception. A man who can penetrate the mysteries of life and unfold them to the common people. So that is the poet's role. That is public role. He is in between the mysteries of life and the common people. So there has to be some wise man, some man of perception who can explain to the common people what is what. So this task, they thought, was to be performed by the poets. Hence, poet was held to be superior to the common humanity. Then the third Victorian critic, Matthew Arnold, he is actually the most representative of the age, because others wrote a piece or two on poetry. But he was the one who wrote lot of critical pieces, both theoretical as well as practical. So for the first time, you have someone who has done theoretical as well as practical criticism on such a large scale. He put together these essays and called them Essays in Criticism. First series, which came out in 1865, and then the second, 79. So, two series of several hundred pages each, 2 volumes. That much output we had from Matthew Arnold. No other critic before him or as a contemporary of his during the Victorian age had done so much. That is why he stands out. He has the highest position in the history of literary criticism. And practical criticism begins with him. Theoretical criticism, of course, was always there right from Aristotle. In fact, even before that, Plato. And through Plato, Socrates. But practical criticism, what is good or bad, what are the virtues and deficiencies of a particular piece of poetry, this begins with Matthew Arnold, and on a large scale, as I said. He wrote about so many poets, wrote about so many poems, not with any vengeance, not with any ill will against anyone, because that is not criticism. That is just like Byron's English bards and Scotch reviewers. You are hitting at each other. There is a kind of fight, quarrel, which is not a literary activity, which is not an intellectual activity. But here Matthew Arnold made it a literary and an intellectual activity, a balanced one. That is why he wrote for the first time the function of criticism. What is criticism? No one had before him defined it so lucidly, so clearly, and so emphatically. And he does it. He says, the function of criticism is to be able to see the object as in itself it really is. So, Victorian realism. Here is an authentic statement about Victorian realism, because the Romantics were accused of not seeing the object as in itself it really is, under the influence of their emotion, under the influence of their inspiration, under the influence of one thing or another. They never got to see the object as in itself it really is. So, what we have there is colored picture one way or another. Thank you. Well, all right, to resume the story of Victorian criticism, Matthew Arnold not only wrote the function of criticism for the first time, defining very clearly that the business of criticism is not in the ordinary sense to criticize, means to find faults. He says, no. The business of criticism, responsible criticism, literary criticism, is to be able to see the object as in itself it really is. So, one has to get into the very soul of the literary piece. It may be a poem, it may be a play, it may be a novel or an essay, whatever. As a critic, your first job is to try to understand what it is about. And then whatever you have understood, honestly, objectively, put down as a description, as a narrative of that piece. That, Arnold says, is the function of criticism and no other. Very great for the first time. Such a clean, objective definition of criticism was given. The highest reach of criticism is possible only if you follow Arnold's dictum. So, that is what he did. Another piece that he wrote besides function of criticism, of course, as I said, he wrote very many essays, but I'll mention the more important ones. Another basic essay was study of poetry, because there you get to know what is poetry and what do you look for in a poem. So he clearly lays down there also. This is what he says in the study of poetry. I quote, "More and more mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. Without poetry, our science will appear incomplete, and most of what now passes with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry." So, very high and very lofty view of poetry. Nothing could have been higher than this. This is the highest esteem in which poetry is being held. He says, poetry will replace both philosophy and religion. Nobody had ever dared say that. And he argues there. He says the problem with religion is that ultimately it gets reduced into a dogma. That's why he wrote another essay called Poetry and Dogma, or Literature and Dogma. He says literature, especially poetry, is one form of writing which cannot be reduced into a dogma. But religion sooner or later gets reduced into a dogma. Dogma is you do this, do not do that. So you become a dogmatic mind. You do not leave any scope for understanding, for interpretation, for application of anyone's mind. It is just like what we do in the temples or churches. You go and worship, either accept or don't go there. So this is the difference that Matthew Arnold makes out between poetry on one side and religion and philosophy on the other. He says even philosophy becomes dogmatic. It may be Marxism, it may be some other ism. Ultimately, it becomes a dogma. And those who believe in it become dogmatic. It becomes a sort of religion for them. So Matthew Arnold gives the most sensible definition of poetry as well as criticism. That poetry is one sort of writing which cannot be reduced into a dogma. If you do, it's not really a great poetry. It's not much of a poetry. So Matthew Arnold has his importance here. That is why the emphasis is on to be able to see the object as in itself it really is. Greatest effort. There is no scope for any deviation, any sort of distortion. You have to get into the very soul and spirit of the object and see it as in itself it really is. So this is the highest reach of Victorian realism that we find in Matthew Arnold. After Matthew Arnold, we have John Ruskin. But one thing we may add to Matthew Arnold, I think that's important. He gave as a tool of literary criticism what is called the touchstone method. It of course cannot be called to be very objective, because his idea of touchstone method is that you think of the best of lines from the greatest of writers. It may be Homer or Shakespeare, and you use those lines as a sort of touchstone to measure the merit of other poets or other poetic compositions. Now, this has come under heavy criticism. In the first place, it is not very appreciable that you measure one poet by the virtue or excellence of another poet. Today we will say that every poet exists in her or his own right and has his her own uniqueness. You cannot really compare any two poets, because they have their different uniqueness, different points of strength or weakness. So it is not acceptable to anyone today. But the idea was not, to my mind, really bad. Because after all, it makes you aware of what is excellent in any literature. So unless you are aware of the best available in a particular language or literature, how do you really come to appreciate the good literature? And how do you come to identify the not so good? So to be able to have some yardstick, some measurement for the quality or virtue of literature, you have to have this. And Matthew Arnold suggested this. As I said, not acceptable today, but it was not altogether wrong. So John Ruskin comes to mind, the next one. Very important in his own right, particularly important for one thing, and he gave, like Arnold had given touchstone method, Ruskin gave the idea of pathetic fallacy. So he also has a yardstick to measure the virtue or vice, the success or failure of a work of art. And that is measured by the idea of pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy is when you say attach, associate and ascribe human emotions to non-living things, just as the Romantics did. Romantics are writing about the daffodils or some other flower as if they are living humans, making these objects of nature speak and behave emotionally, intellectually, as if they were just like us. Because the romantic belief was that what we call life, the spirit of life, is the same in every object of nature. It may be plant, it may be animal, it may be human. In all objects of nature, the life spirit is the same. This was the belief. But Ruskin says no. This is pathetic fallacy. It is fallacious. It is wrong to attribute pathos to non-living things. A tree cannot feel the way a human would. He has a point. So he says, this is pathetic fallacy. Fallacy of pathos, wrongly placed, where they do not really properly belong. So that is Ruskin's contribution as a literary critic in the Victorian age. The idea of pathetic fallacy. Then another Victorian critic who is among the later Victorians is Walter Pater. Walter Pater comes in the second phase of Victorian age, and that phase gives a twist and turn to the original ethos of Victorianism. Now, these writers like Walter Pater or Oscar Wilde, they turn their back on the Victorian ideas. Their contention is that poetry is the wrong place to debate those ideas. If you have to debate ideas, there are other platforms. You can do it better in prose. They have a point. So you cannot make poetry as criticism of life. If you have to make it a vehicle for ideas, for debate, for promoting or advancing your ideas on life, they say, Ruskin and co., that there are better media available. Prose media, essay, debate, treatise, you can do it there. Why misuse the poetic platform for it? That is their objection. So, Walter Pater comes in the same line, but with a difference. The early Victorians, they were men of ideas, and they debated ideas, and they wanted a live and intimate relationship between life and literature, ideas and poetry. But the later Victorians, the younger ones, they reacted against it. They said no. Poetry for poetry's sake, literature for literature's sake, art for art's sake. That is where the theory or philosophy of art for art's sake came. Art not for the sake of anything else, not for any political ideas or even cultural ideas, not for any philosophy, spiritual or sensuous. So they rejected all that, rejected outright, rejected wholesale, and they insisted that poetry or literature or arts in general have to be for their own sake. Well, somebody humorously asked, what is that sake for which you think poetry and the rest can survive or live upon? If you take away the component of life, what is poetry? Can it be all the time about the music in poetry, the style, the form? So they had a point, but then they rubbed it too far and rubbed it too much, and therefore took an extreme position, which is self-annihilating. You cannot really have a poetry without life, poetry without ideas, poetry without emotions. After all, poetry has to be about something. How come for its own sake? What is that sake? It has to be about human experience one way or another. What else do you describe or talk about in poetry? So these questions were raised, but then they had their own philosophy. Their idea was to liberate arts from the dominance of politics, dominance of social and cultural ideas, debates. Well, they do have a point, but then, as it always happens, when you are reacting against something, you take another extremist position. So that is what art for art's sake advocates, Walter Pater and others, even Oscar Wilde. They took that extreme position, which is self-defeating. Any extreme position in literature or elsewhere has to be self-defeating, because you have to have some, you say, room for the other. There is always the other. So you can't have something absolute. So here is a case, art for art's sake. Walter Pater had raised that slogan, but then later came under heavy criticism. What is that sake after all? Sake that after all. So Walter Pater's rhetoric was not the fruit of experience, but experience itself is the end of poetry and arts. Not the fruit of experience, but experience itself is the end. No theory has any claim on us which we have not felt on our pulses. Well, he does have a point. In other words, he is not totally ruling out ideas from poetry, not even theory, so long as it is interiorized, so long as it is not something coming from outside, as something interfering, something intervening. something alien to the very nature of arts. So there he has a point, because you cannot make poetry a medium for anything and everything. You can't have scientific debates there. You can't have political debates there. After all, it has to have its own area of operation. General life, yes. Life experiences of joy and sorrow, yes. These are the domains of poetry, but not outright discussion of politics or theory or science. No, you cannot do that. If you do, then you will not be able to produce a great poetry. Not poetry, in fact, in the first place. So, this is what Walter Pater said, and rightly. He is emphasizing the role of experience in arts. He says arts are concerned with experience as such, not the lessons that you draw from it, not the wisdom that you draw from it. So that after work has nothing to do with poetry. Poetry deals with experience as such. So leave experience in its original form. Don't distort it by using it for some theoretical purposes, using it for your own political, social, cultural, whatever ends. Which means don't use it as a means, as a tool. That is why they raised the slogan of art for art's sake. It is not available for external uses, for anyone and everyone to come and use arts. Arts have their own domain. So they had a point, Walter Pater and company, art for art's sake. That is why Walter Pater and after him Oscar Wilde, they insisted upon this. Well, Pater wrote a piece called Intentions, and there you find all these ideas about poetry, about arts in general. So you have dialogues on art just as you have in Plato. And Oscar Wilde, emotion for its own sake. And he emphasized form, not content. So the clear difference between the early Victorians and the later Victorians. Earlier ones for ideas, particularly socio-cultural ideas, and they thought that was the life of arts, of poetry. The later Victorians said no, poetry and arts have nothing to do with anything outside themselves. So art for art's sake. Let politics or culture or any other extraneous department find its own ways of selling itself. You cannot make use of arts. So there they wanted to maintain the purity of arts, hence the emphasis on art for art's sake, treating it as a separate domain and not to be violated by any other extraneous domain. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very vivacious session where we try to understand about Victorian criticism. Dear friends, we would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing on the modernist movement under the series, The History of English Literature. We believe that you might have liked today's lecture. And you have grabbed maximum knowledge through this lecture. If you want to give your feedback for this lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in, as well as all your questions are welcomed here. We love to solve your queries the next time when Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya visits our studio. So keep writing to us and keep watching these lectures with the help of YouTube. We would be meeting again. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.